Welcome to this special edition of Aspire, the Tape of the Month Club for the Seventh-day Adventist Ministry. This is your tape editor, Orly Berg. Our October release features a discussion of the recent publication, Prophetess of Health, by Ronald Numbers, published by Harper & Row. In the light of the article appearing in the August 2 issue of Time magazine and other publicity given to this volume, this material is most timely and I am sure will be welcomed. Then Dr. James Crawford offers some helpful suggestions to those wishing to lick a weight problem. He also gives suggestions for a minister's exercise program. This special health edition concludes with a series of brief devotional messages by a physician of the Washington, D.C. area. You'll appreciate his unique approach to our physical and spiritual health. But now to the discussion of Prophetess of Health, a study of Ellen G. White. It would be helpful if, before listening, you were to read the critique prepared by the White Estate entitled A Discussion and Review of Prophetess of Health. If you have not received your copy, they are available without charge from the White Estate. Recording time for the interview that follows is approximately 90 minutes. I hold here the book, Prophet of Health, a study of Ellen G. White by Ronald Numbers. This book has just been published by Harper & Row. I'm Orly Berg, and here to give us a reaction to this book and its contents are three representatives from the White Estate. First of all, we have here Elder Arthur White. You've been with us quite a while in the White Estate, haven't you?
Yes, 47 years I've been connected with the White Estate. It's been a great place to work.
Well, then, Dr. Robert Olson, how about you?
Orly, I've only been with the White Estate about 2 years, but I really have enjoyed working in this office.
And W.P. Bradley.
Well, Brother Berg, I've been a trustee of the White Estate Affairs and chairman for a number of years and am still enjoying close association with them.
Now, on this book, the jacket says, Ronald L. Numbers, professor at Madison, Wisconsin. Could you, Elder Bradley, tell us a little bit more about the author of this book?
Well, yes, Dr. Numbers is a member of a well-known Adventist family and has been a member of the church through his life, I believe. He is at present assistant professor of the history of medicine and science at Wisconsin University. Now, before this, he was at Loma Linda University, where he was an instructor in the history of medicine. As to his church membership, I believe he's a member of the Loma Linda University Seventh-day Adventist Church, although he now lives in Madison, Wisconsin.
In the preparation of this material, he says in his foreword here that he had several contacts with the White Estate. Elder White, could you give us a little more information on this?
Yes, this is very true. In July 1972, we at our office received a letter from Dr. Numbers, who was then serving as a member of the faculty of Loma Linda University, in which he informed us that he had been given a grant from the Walter E. McPherson Society of the university, and as an instructor in the history of medicine, he wished to come back and examine the materials which we have in the Ellen G. White Estate, which had to do with the beginnings of our health work. Now, we welcome research in the materials in the White Estate files, and we wrote back very cordially inviting him to come to Washington, spend time with us, and we would make the records available to him for his study. And it wasn't long after this that Dr. Numbers did come back and spent a full week with us in examining the records which we have in the White Estate, and he was given access to all the materials for which he made request, because we are ever ready to serve and to give assistance to those who are working in the building up of the cause of God.
Did he submit the final manuscript to you before its publication?
Well, let me go back of that a bit. It was perhaps after he'd worked for a time in the development of his book, that we discerned that his approach was one which was not favorable. He was apparently seeking for information which would put in question Ellen G. White and her work. And on several occasions, I talked with him, urging that as an historian, he work in a responsible way with the sources which we had made available to him. And in response to this, he said that he would wish me to read the manuscript before it was sent to the publishers, and we agreed to this and expected at that time to be able to make any suggestions or give any counsel which the reading of the manuscript might call for. Actually, when he had the manuscript ready to go to the publishers, Harper & Row in New York City, he gave me a call on the telephone and said, I have the manuscript finished. I'm sending a copy to the publishers and a copy to you. And in response to this, I said, now, wait a minute, Ron. I said, it has been my understanding that we were to read the manuscript before it went to the publishers, and we were to have an opportunity to give counsel as to accuracy of presentation and so on. Well, he said it's late. The manuscript has been promised ere this, and we must get it on to the publishers. And this was a great disappointment to us, of course, and we felt that it was hardly in harmony with the arrangements which had been made. And so when we received the manuscript, we did not read it. We sealed it and placed it in the vault because we did not wish to give Dr. Numbers an opportunity to say that the manuscripts had been read by Arthur White when there was no actual time for an input in the survey of the manuscript and making suggestions. It wasn't until a later time that we actually read the manuscript.
Now, in the preface of the book, he says, "This is, I believe, the first book about her that seeks neither to defend nor to damn, but simply to understand." Well, that sounds like a reasonable approach. Dr. Olson, would you like to speak to this?
Yes, it does sound good. The author says he has tried to be objective, and I think that we should give him credit for trying. But really, he has not accomplished this objective too well, because the book has had the effect of unsettling the confidence of many readers in Ellen White, and it does tend to destroy the reader's confidence. I would like to mention 4 particular areas or aspects of the author's work that have this tendency. First is that there are many misstatements of fact. And second, there are repeated insinuations that Ellen White was dishonest. In the preface to his work, the author states on page 11 that there are certain presuppositions which he has that are different from a typical Adventist historian. He says, "I have parted company with those Adventist scholars who insist on the following presuppositions." And one of them is that as a sincere, dedicated Christian and a prophet, Ellen White would not and did not falsify. So he's parted with that presupposition. He's willing to believe that she lied. And there are insinuations in his book repeatedly that she was dishonest. And then there's a third aspect of the work also that really is quite uncomplimentary to Ellen White, and that is that all through the book there is a belittling of Mrs. White, of her husband James White, and even of the Adventist Church in its earlier days. And fourthly, there is a highly selective use of facts. Frequently, contrary evidence which was available to the author was omitted because it would have given a different picture. And so here are 4 phases of the work, all of which, when you look at it carefully, will lead the reader, many readers, to come to the conclusion that the author has not been that objective.
Well, let's zero in on some of these, Bob. You say first that she misstated the facts. Could you give us some specific examples of this?
Yes, I think we should give examples when we have made a comment like this. I am on page 19 of the author's work, and here is what he says. "According to the testimony of numerous physicians and curiosity seekers, that's Ellen White's, vital functions slowed alarmingly during vision, with her heart beating sluggishly and respiration becoming imperceptible. So he describes Ellen White in vision as breathing, but the breathing or respiration is just, just imperceptible. And then he quotes the Kellogg's on this, the bottom of page 19. The two Kellogg doctors, Merritt and John, believed she suffered from catalepsy, which, as the latter described it, quotes, is a nervous state allied to hysteria in which sublime visions are usually experienced. The muscles are set in such a way that ordinary tests fail to show any evidence of respiration, but the application of more delicate tests show that there are slight breathing movements sufficient to maintain life. Now, this is a quotation from Kellogg in 1933 when he was 81 years old. And if we go back into the records, we find no evidence at all that John Harvey Kellogg ever saw her in vision. But he is the one who has made this statement. We do have a record of his brother, Merritt Kellogg, seeing her in vision, and Merritt Kellogg says that she did not breathe. Now, this is in the book Messenger to the Remnant, page 22. So here's Dr. Merritt Kellogg. He was 21 years old at the time he saw her. He's writing this in 1890, some years later. He said, Sister White was in vision about 20 minutes or half an hour. As she went into vision, everyone present seemed to feel the power and presence of God, and some of us did indeed feel the Spirit of God resting upon us mightily. We were engaged in prayer and social meeting Sabbath morning at about 9 o'clock. Brother White, my father, and Sister White had prayed, and I was praying at the time. There had been no excitement, no demonstrations. And then he describes how she went into vision and says Dr. Drummond, a physician who was also a First-day Adventist preacher, who before he saw her in vision had declared her visions to be of mesmeric origin, that he could give her a vision, stepped forward and after a thorough examination turned very pale and remarked, she doesn't breathe. So here is a physician who examined her and said she did not breathe. And further on in this statement, Merritt Kellogg said he saw it other times, and he's sure that she didn't breathe. Then on page 25 of Messenger to the Remnant is a statement by George I. Butler. He says it has been proved many times that she didn't breathe by tightly holding the nostrils and mouth with the hand. Tightly holding nostrils and mouth with the hand so that not the slightest breath escapes, and he said they held her that way many times for 10 minutes. Now, you see, the author of Prophetess of Health does not state those facts as they are. Instead, he says her respiration became imperceptible. Now, this is not clear to the ordinary reader, but is a misstatement of fact. And this is the type of thing which will lead the unknowledgeable reader to come to a wrong conclusion.
Yes. Are there other examples of misstatement of facts? Brethren, join in also. Elder White?
Yes, I would like to point out one which appears here on page 129 of the book, dealing with short skirts and sex, in which the author sets forth two statements from Ellen White, one written in 1863 and one written in 1867, which would appear to be a conflict, and obviously that's the reason for including them. The 1863 statement was, God would not have his people adopt the so-called reform dress. The statement in 1867 is, God would now have his people adopt the reform dress. Now, what the author fails to do is to point out that Ellen White was very careful in her differentiation between the so-called reform dress and the reform dress which she a few years later advocated. They were not the same. The so-called reform dress was that which had been adopted by the folk at the Dansville Institution and in some other areas, in which the attire of the woman was very much like that of a man. It was known as the American costume, and Ellen White indicated that for a number of reasons this should not be adopted by Seventh-day Adventists, and that statement was made in 1863, and she also refers to it in 1865. But in the basic health reform vision given to her in 1863, she was shown three companies of women, in one company was wearing a style of dress which the angel said the Lord approved of, and this was a reform from the current style of dress with its hoop skirts, with its trailing skirts, and with its tight corsets. It was a style of dress which was perfectly easy, and the lungs and the heart could have healthy action, as they wrote at the time. And she wrote of its value from the standpoint of health and modesty and so on. So the author in the book fails to differentiate between the so-called reform dress and the reform dress, and thus the reader is left with a misconcept.
I'd like to mention another thing, Orly, and that is the sentence on page 149 of Prophetess of Health, where the author uses the word bumps, thus linking Ellen White with the very popular and growing interest in what they call phrenology. Now, of course, he tries to link her quite closely with this, saying that she used the vocabulary, and but actually she had a little brush with it when she was up there at Dansville, had the boys examined, and the doctor, who himself was interested in phrenology, spoke of the fine shape of his head. Although the boys weren't brought there for that purpose, to have a phrenological examination, and there was no chart made, the doctor himself was interested and so introduced this. But anyway, in Prophetess of Health, it says, for instance, she complained that his large and active bumps of cautiousness, conscientiousness, and benevolence, all assets in time of health, were in sickness painfully excitable and a hindrance to his recovery. Well, now, actually, Ellen White never uses that word bumps. Here's what she actually said. All who are acquainted with my husband know that his cautiousness, conscientiousness, and benevolence have been large and active and ruling traits in his character, and have been special blessings in qualifying him for his business career in connection with the work and advancement of the cause of truth. You see, bumps isn't used there at all. And it's a little unfair for him to bring in that word bumps in this connection. Now, he tried to link Ellen White with this along. He says that in a phrenological atmosphere, says that Mrs. White herself was a woman of singularly well-balanced mental organization, notable for her traits of benevolence, spirituality, conscientiousness, and ideality, as though this linked her with phrenology. Actually, you just have to stretch your imagination to bring phrenology into this. These are ordinary terms that people use in describing character, and his introduction of this subject, the way he does it here, using the word bumps and then stressing her relationship to it, is certainly very much overdrawn.
Sort of a misuse of facts, isn't
Right.
it, Bob?
I'd like to mention another illustration too, Orly. On page 136 of the book we're discussing, the author says that Mrs. White used this description of the length of the reform dress. The dress should reach somewhat below the top of the boot, but should be short enough to clear the filth of the sidewalk and street without being raised by the hand. And then he intimates that this contradicted an earlier statement. No specific length was given, but alert readers were not slow in pointing out that the top of the boot was a good deal higher than, quotes, an inch or two, unquotes, from the street. And so the impression is given to the reader that Ellen White is contradicting herself. She's saying the dress should reach below the top of the boot. Earlier she said an inch or two from the street, which would be quite a bit lower. Well, what did Ellen White actually say? In Volume 1 of the Testimonies, page 424, Ellen White made the statement that the dress, instead of being an inch or two from the street, she said if women would wear their dresses so as to clear the filth of the streets an inch or two, their dresses would be modest and so on. So she is not contradicting herself. The statement now that the dress should come about to the top of the boot is essentially the same as saying that the dress should clear the filth of the street an inch or two. If you're going to clear the filth of the street in those days, your dress would certainly have to be about 9 inches from the ground. Remember, they had no paved roads, the streets were muddy, and also they had a lot of horses that were the principal source of power for their traveling around, and so I am told that the streets of New York City had to be cleaned every night. And so Mrs. White is not contradicting herself. This may appear to be a little item, but when you put a series of things like this together, the reader is getting the impression that Ellen White is constantly contradicting herself.
Isn't it true that what Ellen White is trying to get at here is to get the skirts up off the ground, low enough to be modest, as modesty of that time, but whether it was a certain number of inches wasn't really a factor of consequence. It was to get the skirts shortened so that the women could move around more easily, and they'd be more healthful, and so on.
That's right. She said the Lord did not show her an exact number of inches, but she saw these three companies of women in the vision, and then she had to describe what she saw at a later time.
I think another illustration of where there's the problem of the character we're discussing, find it in the chapter on short skirts and sex. We referred to this chapter before. But in this, the author refers to the publication of Ellen White in 1864 of an appeal to mothers, which, as most people know, dealt with the question of secret vice, or masturbation as we would call it today. Now, here is the presentation of the matter as it's made in the book on page 152. Her explanation for writing on this delicate subject was a recent vision, apparently the one of June 1863, in which her angel guide had directed her attention to the present corrupt state of the world. Everywhere I looked, she recalled with obvious horror, I saw imbecility, dwarf forms, crippled limbs, misshapen heads, and deformity of every description, unquote. Sickened by the sight before her, she learned, says the author, that it had resulted from the practice of solitary vice, so widespread that a large share of youth now living were worthless. Now, actually, when we go back to the paragraph as it appears on page 17 of Appeal to Mothers, we find this. Ellen White has been dealing with the problem of masturbation and what it meant to the children and the family, and the pamphlet is devoted mainly to this. But in this setting, she drops in a whole paragraph in which she goes back to the vision of June 1863, in which she, in general terms, describes what was one of the scenes which was given to her at that time. And, turning to the original source, it reads, "The state of our world was presented before me. My attention was especially called to the youth of our time. Everywhere I looked, I saw imbecility, dwarf forms, crippled limbs, misshapen heads, and deformity of every description. Sins and crimes and the violation of nature's laws were shown to me as the cause of this accumulation of human woe and suffering. I saw such degradation and vile practices and so on, such defiance of God, and heard such words of blasphemy that my soul was sickened." And then further along in the paragraph, she speaks of unsuspecting parents try the skill of one physician after another who prescribe drugs when they generally know the real cause of failing health, but so on. Now, the point is this. We do not find in the Numbers book the sentence in which Ellen White actually describes the cause of the deplorable situation that was revealed to her. She listed sins and crimes and violation of nature's laws were shown me as the cause of this accumulation of human woe and suffering. Now, this is not included in the book. Rather, the author of the book explains, sickened by the sight before her, she learned that it had resulted from the practice of solitary vice. So, while solitary vice may have been a factor, and likely was, in certain phases of this, it is not the one cause of this deplorable situation which was opened up to Ellen White as she was given a view of the world. Now, it's interesting to notice that in the next writing on the subject of health, Appeal to Mothers was published in April 64, that in the next writing on the subject of health, which was her basic article on health, which was published in Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4 in 1864, in which she, for the first time, goes down the line and presents what was shown to her in the vision, she makes this statement, and it's interesting because it's related closely to the other. Apparently, she's harking back to the same scene, and I read, "The state of our world was presented before me, and my attention was especially called to the youth of our time. Everywhere I looked..." Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading the one in How to Live. Let me take you to Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4. "The present corrupt state of the world was presented before me. The sight was terrible. I have wondered that the inhabitants of the earth were not destroyed like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. I have seen reason enough for the present state of degeneracy and mortality in the world. Blind passion controls reason, and every high consideration with many is sacrificed to lust. The first great evil was intemperance in eating and drinking. Men and women have made themselves slaves of appetite. They are intemperate in labor." So in this reference to this scene, the deplorable scene which was presented to her, she ties it into intemperance and eating and drinking and lustful appetites and so on. Now, in the next year, in March 1865, she published How to Live No. 3, which was dealing very largely with drugs. And she makes this statement, again apparently going back to this view which was given to her in 1863, the same view that is referred to in the others. "Physicians, by administering their drug poisons, have done very much to increase the depreciation of the race physically, mentally, and morally. Everywhere you may go, you will see deformity, disease, and imbecility, which in very many cases can be traced," now note this, "in very many cases can be traced directly back to drug poisons administered by the hand of a doctor as a remedy for some of life's ills." So here she brings in another causative factor. Now, there's no question today, of course, about the drugs being a contributing factor towards birth defects. Interestingly enough, in 1890, in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 561, Ellen White broadened the statement regarding the deformities in children to include the excessive use of alcohol. She wrote, "As the result of prenatal intemperance, as the result of parental intemperance, children often lack physical strength and mental and moral power. To a great degree, parents are responsible not only for the violent passions and perverted appetites of their children, but for the infirmities of the thousands born deaf, blind, diseased, and idiotic." So it's rather unfair, because Ellen White dropped into the presentation on an Appeal to Mothers, dropped this impressive scene of the results of the violation of nature's laws. It's rather unfair to maintain that all this resulted from masturbation, as is clearly indicated by the author of Prophetess of Health.
Well, there's also the area in his book in the chapter Short Skirts and Sex, in which he talks about Ellen White's sex viewpoint, and he tries to picture her as an individual that was fanatical, and through the years advising against sex, and he even brings into to the chapter in the last paragraph on page 159 a statement that in her waning years she looked forward expectantly to that existence in the new earth when she'd be free from such unpleasant activities. Now, when we go back in this, you will find on page 157, just a little before that, he says, though she never defined exactly what she meant by excessive, it seems likely, since she generally agreed with earlier health reformers in such matters, that she would have frowned on having intercourse more frequently than once a month. That was the maximum Sylvester Graham had condoned. Now, to get this straightened out, we ought to go back to Sylvester Graham and see just what he said. And I have it right here, orally, in front of me. It is therefore impossible, these are Graham's words, to lay down a precise rule which will be equally adapted to all men in regard to the frequency of their connubial commerce. I guess you can interpret that in modern day language, you know what he means. But as a general rule, it may be said, I'm reading now from him, to the healthy and robust, it were better for you not to exceed the frequency of your indulgences, the number of months in the year. Now that's once a month, you see. But then he goes right on, and you cannot exceed the number of weeks in the year. In other words, once a week, you see, without impairing your constitutional powers, shortening your lives, and increasing your liability to disease and suffering. So here Graham has two limits, once a month, once a week. But you see, he never gives that rather broad and temperate viewpoint. He gives the one where Ellen White is shown to be somewhat fanatical in her viewpoint. Actually, she was quite temperate. She says, don't go to excess, be reasonable, and she spoke against abuse of the privilege in the marriage relation, but she never in anywhere wrote a line in which she told the frequency that married partners should exercise their privilege.
Very well. All right, we better move along. Bob, you mentioned in that list of four that you gave there at the beginning, insinuations of dishonesty, that Mrs. White was dishonest. Can you give
Yes,
some...
let me just mention a few of these places, Orly. On page 21 of the book Prophetess of Health, I read this. She professed to be just as dependent upon the Spirit of the Lord in relating or writing a vision as in having the vision. You see, this is the way that it's said. It sounds like she really wasn't dependent on the Lord. She professed to be. There's a little insinuation there that it was not what she claimed to be. Page 95, there is a similar statement. If we accept the testimony of John Harvey Kellogg, who as a teenager set type for How to Live, by the way, he was 13 when this book was published, Ellen White was more than passingly familiar with at least Coles's philosophy of health by the time she wrote her articles. It seems that she, Ellen White, shared with Sylvester Graham and others a reluctance to acknowledge her intellectual and literary debts. There's the insinuation she was dishonest because she didn't mention every source from which she used phraseology. And then page 156 is another one like this. He speaks about her flow of divinely sent messages, and then says, but she neglected, as she so often did, to cite her earthly source for these divinely sent messages. Again, it's more than just an implication, it's a strong insinuation that she was dishonest in what she did. Now, I would like to discuss this a moment, if you don't mind, Orly.
Yes, I'd like to know what was the standard practice a century ago.
I am not discussing whether she used the language and phraseology of others. This is a fact, she did. The question is, was she dishonest? And is there even an element of dishonesty in her doing so? Now, it was not customary, from the records that we can gather, for a person to, let's say, attach his name to a poem that another wrote, something that was creative in that sense. But essays and works of prose were frequently used by others without credit. Let me just read what John Wesley said. Now, I don't think anybody would challenge John Wesley's honesty. And he mentions how he wrote his commentaries and how he did not give credit for things that he used. He said,
Where are you reading from?
I'm quoting from page 406 of the book Ellen G. White and Her Critics by F.D. Nichol.
I hope all of our ministers have that, Bob, in their library.
Well, it's an excellent book, really, to answer questions that are raised about Mrs. White's work. John Wesley says this, "It was a doubt with me for some time whether I should not subjoin to every note I received from them the name of the author from whom it was taken, especially considering I had transcribed some and abridged many more, almost in the words of the author." Wesley says, I used their language. "But upon farther consideration I resolved to name none, that nothing might divert the mind of the reader from keeping close to the point of view and receiving what was spoken only according to its own intrinsic value." So what John Wesley is saying is this: if I had given everybody credit for everything I used from them, it would have diverted the reader's attention too much, and I wanted him to get the message that I was giving. So I gave no credit to anyone. There's another quotation on the same page, 406, that Nichol includes here, which is just as clear. I won't take time to read that. Now, in Dr. Numbers' book, he mentions on pages 51 and 52 that many of the health reformers used other health reformers' works, copied their language, and so on. He says here on page 51, in the 1830s, about Sylvester Graham, he borrowed liberally from the French pathologist Rousset. And then on page 52, about the 8th line from the top, "Following what was too often the custom of his day, Graham insisted on his own originality and refused to acknowledge his indebtedness to Rousset or any other writer." So Dr. Numbers acknowledges that the health reformers were all using the language of others, and he rather indicates that they shouldn't have done this. Now, is it fair for us to take a standard of the present time, the 20th century, a scholarly procedure that we use now, and apply it to the people who lived 100 years ago and wrote with a different set of standards? They were all doing this, and so it hardly seems fair to be critical of them or critical of Mrs. White for this. Now, was Mrs. White being dishonest at all when she was using the language of others? I would like to point out that before she quoted from Coles and Mann in her own works, she printed articles from them in her own book, How to Live, published in 1865. And she published in that book some of the very things that she used later, and which Dr. Numbers quotes and cites in his parallel columns. So she had called the attention of her readers to the importance of Cole's work and Mann's work, had quoted from them, quoted their whole articles, given them credit. Later she used some of their own language. There certainly is no attempt at dishonesty here at all. And I really feel that this has not been fairly dealt with in the book Prophetess of Health.
Now, she says here, Bob...
By the way, there are other illustrations that we could add to this, like the book Sketches from the Life of Paul. You know, this is not in the health field. But 4 months before the book Sketches from the Life of Paul came out...
That's Coney Barrenhausen you're speaking of?
No, I'm talking about her book.
Oh, yes.
Her book. 4 months before her book came out, I think it was 1883, why, she called attention of the readers of the Science of the Times to the importance of Coney Barrenhausen's book, urged them to buy it, see?
Yes.
And she had, about 7% of her book has language that is similar, close phraseology to Coney Barrenhausen. And some people have said, oh, look, she just copied from them. But she told her readers, Coney Barrenhausen's book is a good book, get it and use it. Then 4 months later, here comes her book. So there is no attempt at dishonesty in this. She felt free, as others did, to use the language of different writers in expressing her own ideas.
The question I was going to raise, Bob, she mentions about using her own words. Here's her statement. Although I am as dependent upon the Spirit of the Lord in writing my views as I am in receiving them, yet the words I employ in describing what I have seen are my own, unless they be those spoken to me by an angel, which I always enclose in marks of quotation.
You see here, you're getting into the subject of inspiration and how the work of a prophet is actually done, how he relates himself to God and how he relates himself also to the messages which he receives and has to give to the people. Now, I think there's nothing clearer than what Ellen White has given us in Selected Messages, Book 1, beginning on page 20, for example. She says, the Bible is not given to us in grand superhuman language. Jesus, in order to reach men where he is, took humanity. The Bible must be given in the language of men. And then she says, she makes this remarkable sentence. Everything that is human is imperfect. You see? In other words, it isn't grand superhuman language. It's human language. Then on the next page she says, the Bible is written by inspired men, but it is not God's mode of thought and expression. It is that of humanity. God as a writer is not represented. And then she says further down, the writers of the Bible were God's penmen, not his pen. And then in the next paragraph, here's this tremendous sentence. It is not the words of the Bible that are inspired, but the men that are inspired.
Very good.
That's why I say, Orly, that we have to have the right idea of inspiration. She says this on page 19. The writers of the Bible had to express their ideas in human language. It was written by human men. These men were inspired by the Holy Spirit. But because of the imperfections of human understanding of language, or the perversity of the human mind, ingenious in evading truth, many read and understand the Bible to please themselves, you see. But fortunately, I'm glad that it isn't inspired word by word in the original Greek or Hebrew, because this means we can translate it and do the best job we can translating it, and we still have God's message that comes to us in human words.
Wonderful.
I'd like to add just a word to that, Orly, where she says here, the words I employ in describing what I've seen are my own. What she means is this. They're words that I have chosen. God did not supply them to me. And she saw fit at times to use the language of Coles, of Graham, or of Coney Barrenhausen. She's saying, God didn't put these words in my mouth. I had to find them myself. And she found them wherever she could. She's not saying that she didn't use the language of other human authors.
Yes.
She's saying, God didn't give me this word for word.
Yeah. Brother White, do you have
Yes,
another example?
I think another example is one which appears on page 27 of the book, and it deals with the reference to the shut door teachings. Now, the shut door question has been dealt with very fully by Elder Nickel and Ellen G. White and their critics. It's dealt with elsewhere. There are materials available from our office on this, and we can't take time to go into the matter as such. But in the book, it is implied or stated that as the pioneers came to see the work before them, and that those who had not rejected the message of the preaching of Christ's second coming in 1844 and prior to 1844, there was a field of labor, and there was an open door as well as a shut door. But the author said, in speaking of the publication of Ellen White's first book, A Sketch of the Christian Experience of Ellen G. White, that the problem was what to do with all Ellen's inspired testimonies indicating the door of mercy had been shut. In an attempt to take care of this embarrassment, she and James collected her early writings, systematically deleted passages that might be construed as supporting the shut door, and published the edited version as Ellen's first book, Sketch of Christian Experience and Teachings, which, by the way, is the first part of early writings as we have it today. From then on, the Whites publicly denied that Ellen had ever been shown that the door was shut. Now, the work which was done by James and Ellen White in preparing her first materials for print did include I might say, as they chose the materials, they did not include everything that had been written before that time. There were some references to the shut door which were not included in her first book, but there are statements just as strong which do appear as those which were not included. So to state that all references to the shut door were cut out is not true to fact. In fact, Ellen White herself, in the first writing of the great controversy, which was published in 1884, Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 4, included a chapter which carried the very title, The Open and the Shut Door. And in that she deals with the shut door question in these words: "The passing of the time in 1844 was followed by a period of great trial to those who still held to the Advent faith. Their only relief, so far as ascertaining their true position was concerned, was the light which directed their minds to the sanctuary above. And as has been stated, Adventists were for a short time united in the belief that the door of mercy was shut. This position was soon abandoned. Some renounced their faith in their former reckoning of the prophetic periods and ascribed to human or satanic agencies the powerful influence of the Holy Spirit which had attended the Advent movement. Another class firmly held that the Lord had led them in their past experiences, and as they had waited and watched and prayed to know the will of God, they saw that their great high priest had entered upon another work of ministration, and following him by faith, they were led to understand also the closing work of the church, and were prepared to receive it and give to the world the warning of the third angel of Revelation 14. This is Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 4, page 272. And she makes virtually the same statement in Great Controversy on page 429. So there was never any attempt on the part to cover up the idea that there was a teaching of the shut door. Now, another question closely related to this is, did Ellen White teach that she was shown in vision that the door of mercy for the whole world was closed in 1844? And in dealing with this subject, the author fails to include two important statements from Ellen White's pen on this subject, where she herself gives an explanation. One of these is found in Selected Messages, Book 1, on page 74, an item taken from a letter written to Elder Loughborough, answering some questions. And I don't have the book before me, but in this, she acknowledges that she, with her fellow Adventists, did believe that the door of mercy was closed, and that it was the visions given to her, particularly the first vision, which led to a change in that concept. And another statement on this same point, written in 1883 and published in Selected Messages, Book 1, pages 63, she states, "For a time after the disappointment in 1844, I did hold in common with the Advent body that the door of mercy was then forever closed to the world. This position was taken before my first vision was given me. It was the light given me of God that corrected our error and enabled us to see the true position. It seems that it's only fair that Ellen White should be given an opportunity to make her own explanations and to discuss the matter, for she was one who participated in it."
Well, she certainly did explain it. Elder Bradley, you had a...
Well, I wanted to touch on one other point that the author brings up in this book, and that is her changing viewpoints. He says that through the years she changed her viewpoint, and he cites as one of the examples of this her counsel regarding the use of physicians. And there is a problem here, but if you look at it, it isn't that difficult. Here was her first statement in 1849. "If any among us are sick, let us not dishonor God by applying to earthly physicians, but apply to the God of Israel. Then she speaks of following the Lord's directions in James the 5th chapter, and says God's promise cannot fail. She was urging the people here to try God and to use divine help. Now, as time went by, he mentions the fact that this statement, which appeared in the broadside of 1849, was not included in some of her later publications. And then he finally comes to 1860, when she said, we believe in the prayer of faith, but some have carried this matter too far, especially those who have been affected with fanaticism. Now, you see, in those days, you had to deal with fanatics a great deal. Some have taken the strong ground that it was wrong to use simple remedies. We have never taken this position, but have opposed it. We believe it to be perfectly right to use the remedies God has placed in our reach. And if these fail, apply to the great physician. Physician here, you see, is capitalized. And in some cases, the counsel of an earthly physician is very necessary. This position we have always held, you see.
Yes.
So you've got to apply that. You've got to apply this back really 11 years earlier when she wrote this 1849 statement. You wonder why she said that up there in view of her later statement about her position. But first of all, we know that the condition of medicine as practiced in the country at that time was very, very poor. And so people with intelligence often tried to avoid the physicians of their time. And then she was very anxious to carry out the Lord's instruction in James the 5th chapter. And thirdly, we don't know all that she said on this matter. We have this one isolated statement, and we don't have a record of other things that she could have said on it, you see. And I guess we'll have to agree also that there are times when in her early writings, earlier works, that Ellen White didn't always make herself clear. She had to go back and correct it. She's done this several times, you know. She'd go back and say, here's what I meant when I said this, you see.
Yes.
So she has to reinterpret herself. Now later on, she began to learn how to wield words in a different way than she did at the very first. So I think we can understand the difference in viewpoint between those 2 points.
Orly, I'd like to add just a word about this. I don't believe it's fair to Ellen White to treat that 1849 statement as an official position statement which she drew up, like a PhD would do today, you know. What if the Lord did not heal an individual? Then what? She didn't discuss this at all. It's just a brief statement by a 22-year-old girl. And to show that she really did believe in going to physicians at times, she herself did that in 1854. Had a little cancer on the eye, and she prayed to the Lord about it. It was not healed. She went to a doctor. So 6 years later, in 1860, when she says, this has been our position, why, her own life has proved it, that she was willing to go to a physician under certain circumstances.
Yes, right. All right, Bob, let's go on now to the next thing. Your third point that you made in that introductory statement indicated that the author has tended to belittle Mrs. White.
Yes, there is a belittling of Ellen White, of James White, of the church at times. Let me just give a few quick references here. On page 47 of the book Prophetess of Health, the author says that James White reported on the progress of the war, but limited his personal involvement to raising bounties for volunteers, securing conscientious objector status for Adventist draftees, and speculating on writing paper and envelopes, which netted him a quick 100% profit on an initial investment of $1,200. The impression is given the reader that this is the main thing that James White was interested in, making a little money for himself. That nothing is said here about this man's patriotism, about the articles he was writing in the Review and Herald on abolitionism, and he opened up the columns of the Review to a discussion of the Civil War topics. He was a member of a committee, an important committee in Battle Creek, that spent a lot of time in raising money, $200. they would pay to somebody who would volunteer. That's about 20 weeks' salary at least. And it was up to him to raise a lot of that money. I think we should also remember that Mrs. White was working without salary, and James and Ellen White were almost under obligation, at least they felt so, to contribute to everything in the cause that came along. And so if he could earn a little on the side some way, why, he certainly was justified in doing so. They were always giving. They gave $500 to the beginning of the New Health Reform Institute, 1866, just a year or two after this. Where'd they get that? Well, this was not from his salary, but he had to have something on the side like this that he could do. Now, another illustration is on page 104 of the book Prophetess of Health, where he says this: while politicians in Washington quarreled bitterly over the best method of healing a divided and scarred nation, the Adventists of Battle Creek dedicated themselves to curing mankind with water, as if the Adventists were not interested in the outcome of the Civil War or in trying to heal our scarred nation. And if you get all the facts, you can see that this is a travesty on the truth. It really is not. It's not treating the church, you see, fairly there. It's a belittling of our church. Page 152 is just a little point, but it's part of this series. Ellen White is quoted at the bottom of the page as saying we should teach our children self-control from their very infancy and learn them the lesson of submitting their wills to us. Now, I have read thousands of pages of Ellen G. White manuscripts, and I don't recall her using the verb learn in that way, even once. But the author has found one. And so this has been introduced into the book here. It seems to me to be an attempt. Well, it is an attempt to belittle the author, to belittle Ellen White. If you will check, though, the Oxford Dictionary of the English Language, you will find illustrations of the verb used in this way, even by Benjamin Disraeli about 100 years ago. He once said he was going to learn the members of Parliament something. So 100 years ago, the word was used in that way by many. Today it is not, so much anyway. And so it should not be, I don't think, quoted in this sense. Then one more illustration, page 146. Dr. Numbers writes of Ellen White going to California after giving up on the matter of the dress reform. It was never one of the important matters, and the people didn't accept it. It became a divisive issue, and so the Lord told her, well, then let's not press it. And so, Dr. Numbers says here, page 146, journeying to California, Mrs. White discreetly left her pants behind. When I read that statement, it really made me feel bad. And it can be interpreted only as an attempt to belittle Ellen White. So you may say these are not very big items, but again, when the reader goes through the book and finds these things appearing repeatedly, there's a certain prejudice in his mind that's created. And I hardly feel that this is a real objective presentation of the subject of the book.
Getting to your fourth point, you mentioned the fact that her selection of facts wasn't always objective as might be expected of an author. Some of the facts relating to the case were omitted. I wonder, Elder White, if you can...
Yes, I'd like to bring in an illustration of that, and where the author builds strongly on assumption, omitting certain documentation. On page 29 of the book, there's described an experience of 1855 in which the burden of the publication of the Review and Herald and its editing was taken over, or was assumed, by a group of believers in Battle Creek, and Uriah Smith became the editor in James White's place. Now, it's very strongly inferred in the book that this change was made, that James White was unseated as the editor because of a certain statement which had appeared from his pen in the Review and Herald of October 16, 1855. This statement is one in which James White, meeting the charges that the doctrinal views held by Seventh-day Adventists were obtained from the visions rather than the Bible. James White speaks out very frankly and said, what is the review to do with Ellen White's views? Everything that's been published in the review is based upon the Bible. But isolating his statement, it would appear that James White's attitude toward the visions was a negative one, which it was not. But he's saying, what does the paper have to do with it? The paper is based upon the Bible. And then the author of the book goes on to say that the same issue of the paper, which contained this statement, also contained the announcement that the editorship of the review was being passed to Uriah Smith, and apparently it was blamed on James White's statement, which interestingly enough appeared in the same issue, which goes to prove that it couldn't be the cause. But to go back and reviewing the history a bit, we find that James White was overburdened with labor. He had been carrying the full responsibility financially and editorially for the Review and Herald, and there came to the time when his health was going down, and he said he published statements indicating that others must carry that responsibility. Such statements appeared in August, where he said, I must be freed from this. And then in an issue in September, his name ceased to appear on the masthead. When he learned that brethren in Michigan were willing to assume some of the responsibility, he dropped his name out from the masthead. He himself did in September. And his statement about the visions and what is the review to do with the views of Ellen White did not appear till October 16, 1855, 1 month after he had, of his own volition, dropped his name as editor of the review. But that same issue, however, did carry the announcement that the brethren in Battle Creek were taking over the responsibility of the review. It's just a picture of presenting only some facts, some assumptions, and leaving out those exhibits which would give the true picture as it emerges in the pages of the Review and Herald of the time.
There's an interesting comment about the use of milk in his book and sterilization. Bob, you want to comment on that?
Orly, I mentioned this to you the other day. Actually, the comment did not get in the book. And this is why I do want to say something about it. On page 176, the author says this. Dr. Kellogg made a point of supplying the prophetess with the latest data from his laboratories and apprising her of developments in medicine and nutrition. Now, there is no evidence in the documents that we have that she ever received this kind of information from him, from the letters we have from him, nothing, and from the letters that she wrote. There's no evidence of acknowledging anything like this. Now, as Elder White stated a while ago, Dr. Numbers sent us his manuscript, I think it was in September of 1974, and as time went by, we used this manuscript as a basis for submitting certain recommendations and suggestions to the publishers and to Dr. Numbers.
Might I just say that this was at their request. The publishers, we contacted the publishers when we learned that the manuscript had been sent to them, and in a very mild way just indicated that the position which Ellen White held in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we understood that they had received a manuscript which was not favorable to Ellen G. White, and we felt that from what we'd heard of it, we had not read it, what we heard of it, that the historical backgrounds had been distorted and Ellen White did not appear in a true image. And we indicated to the publishers we were just calling this to their attention. We were making no demands, we were making no requests, but we thought it was information that might be cherished by them as they were planning to publish a book. And then, in response to that, they asked us to examine the manuscript carefully and present any evidence of distortions which they would take into consideration, for they declared that it was that the publishers did not want to become involved in publishing a book which was not historically accurate. And then, so in response to that, we prepared a careful examination. We then turned to the manuscript I hadn't read it at that time. We then turned to the manuscript, and because they were holding up the publication of the book, and we went through it very carefully and submitted a critique to the publishers and to the author.
Thank you, Elder White. Now, that critique was about 228 pages long, I believe. And in the manuscript, Dr. Numbers' manuscript that he had sent to us, he said this, that I'm not quoting, but this is the idea. He says that in 1904, Dr. Kellogg had written about the importance of sterilizing milk. A year later, 1905, Mrs. White said the same thing in the book Ministry of Healing, and obviously got her information from him. And he said how many times this happened throughout her life, we probably will never know. Now, in our critique, we provided Dr. Numbers with the information that Mrs. White was the first one to write about sterilizing of milk instead of Dr. Kellogg. That is, she had written about it before he did. In Book Counsels in Diet and Food, page 203, she wrote, "The milk used should be procured from healthy cows and should be sterilized." And this is a 1901 statement, 3 years before Dr. Kellogg. In 1896, she was in Australia, and she wrote this, "I use a little boiled milk in my simple homemade coffee." That's letter 73A, 1896, out in Australia. So Dr. Kellogg's writing about it was 8 years after Mrs. White, after her 1896 statement. And we indicated in our critique that if the former writer influenced the latter, then Ellen White should be given the credit for influencing Dr. Kellogg. In his book, he says that Dr. Kellogg influenced Mrs. White. But this particular exhibit was removed from his manuscript completely. And this is what I mean that he has omitted contrary evidence, you see. His thesis is that Ellen White was influenced by other people, not that she influenced others. And this kind of evidence doesn't fit into that theme, and so it is not included in the book. Now, I could mention another illustration of this. On page 174 of the book Prophetess of Health, he says that in her old age she grew increasingly fond of the intelligent and affectionate members of the animal kingdom. The thought of eating any one of them now repulsed her. And so, in the middle of that, page 174, in the case of meat, the focus for not eating it, the reason for not eating it, shifted from its animalizing tendencies to the disease condition of animals and the moral evils of a flesh diet. And then he gives as proof for this the fact that in her early years she was using these reasons of don't eat it because it will tend to strengthen your animal nature. But he says that in the book Ministry of Healing in 1905 she doesn't say that, you see, and that's the last major book on health that came from her pen. Instead, she's talking about the disease condition of animals and also about the suffering it would cause animals. Well, we pointed out in our critique to Dr. Numbers that in 1909, which is 4 years after Ministry of Healing was published, in 1909, Ellen White is saying the very same thing she had said 40 years earlier. And let me just read it to you. I have volume 9 of the Testimonies right before me. This was given at a general conference in Washington, D.C., where she read her own manuscript. She says, "I have been instructed that flesh food has a tendency to animalize the nature, to rob men and women of that love and sympathy which they should feel for everyone, and to give the lower passions control over the higher powers of a being. If meat eating was ever helpful, it's not safe now." Now, if Dr. Numbers had quoted this passage, which we supplied to him, it would have tended to destroy his thesis, you see, and that is that she had changed the emphasis of her teaching on why we shouldn't use why we shouldn't use meat. Mrs. White in 1909 said nothing at all about the suffering of the animals. This is the major reason that she gave, this and the disease condition of animals. So, really, there is an omission of important evidence that would tend to contradict the author's thesis, and therefore I say the book is hardly objectively written.
Yes, so Paul, you have a comment.
Orly.
what we object to overall is the lack of balance in the book. Now, you take the subject, Prophetess of Health, and you expect something much different than has come out from the pen of Dr. Numbers. Now, you take this question of dress reform, you see. Now, Sister White says, and I wish that all of the readers of this book could turn to the Review and Herald of October 8, 1867, where Ellen White answered a number of questions in an extensive review of the whole subject of health reform in the Review and Herald. And in there she says, answering question number 3, the dress reform was among the minor things that were to make up the great reform in health, and never should have been urged as a testing truth necessary to salvation. You see, she didn't plan to make dress reform a great big. And then further along she says, I have in speaking upon the great subject of health mentioned the dress reform as one of the items of least importance which make up the great whole. You see. But when you view all of Ellen White's work, and then you think of an author that focuses on a little thing like health reform, and compare it with the outcome of the output,
dress reform,
the dress reform, and you compare it with the tremendous results of her work, her teaching in health, as well as Dr. Kellogg says. He says that the principles presented have been put to the test of practical experience by thousands, you see. Thousands have been blessed by it. Now he says that at the time that at the writings first appeared, the subject of health was almost wholly ignored, not only by the people to whom it was addressed, but by the world at large. But then he goes down here and testifies, I think this was 1890 he wrote this, that thousands have testified to physical, mental, and moral benefits received. Now this is part of the picture that could have been presented in Prophetess of Health. We would have learned in the book more about Loma Linda University, one of the great medical schools with a special mission in the world, and recognized and now carrying top rating with medical schools. We would have learned about Kettering and Hinsdale and Porter Sanitarium, which are the outgrowth of the health reform teaching, and our workers that worked in these institutions, of Paradise Valley Sanitarium, of Glendale, and then of course of the institutions all around the world. But and then we would have been hearing about statements that Ellen White made back there. You take one that is very well known, and that is about the cause of cancer. And when she mentioned germs as causing cancer, people would smile, you see. But now they don't smile anymore. And all of this has resulted in a blessing to thousands of people. Maybe some of you have kept this in your file, the article from the Review and Herald of December 14, 1967. An article written by Doctors Frank R. Lemon and Jan W. Kuzma, in which they discuss the life expectancy of Seventh-day Adventists. And they join it up to the health habits of the Adventists, particularly the fact that we don't smoke. And they go on to show how the life expectancy of at age 35 of a Seventh-day Adventist man exceeds that of a California man by 6 2/10 years. In other words, he's going to live 6 years longer, and the corresponding future for women is 3.6 years longer than the average in California. And all of this is the outcome of the great health message of Ellen G. White. You see?
Of course, what she said about hydrotherapy certainly proved a great blessing, too.
Of course. It's a great blessing, and it's helped so many people.
If the book had been in balance, it would have mentioned a few of these things.
That's right.
That's the point.
That's right. So Adventists have benefited. We've had a great advantage, as Time Magazine reported a few years ago. The Adventist advantage is something that was a very remarkable thing, and it grew out of Ellen White's work. Now, the world in general has had the help and the instruction of the health reformers, all of these health reformers through the years. But how did it come that the Adventist Church has actually followed, in general, we followed the plans and the teachings of Ellen White, and we've been blessed by it?
Certainly have. Elder White, as we go on now with our discussion, what really is the main objective that the author seems to have in writing this book? Could you...
The main objective becomes very clear as we read the book, and that is to attempt to show that Ellen White received what she sets forth in her writings on health, not from the Lord as she claimed, but from contemporary health writers and from fellow church members. On page 79 and 80 and 81 of the book, the author says, even Sabbatarians displayed more than passing interest in the health reform movement. Joseph Bates adopted Grahamism in 1843. John Loughborough took to eating Graham bread and reading the Water Cure Journal in 1848. J.P. Kellogg raised his sizable brood by the Water Cure Journal. Roswell F. Cottrell began experimenting in the late 1840s with a vegetarian diet and a daily bath. All these were closely associated with the Whites, and undoubtedly spoke to them of their experiences in health reform. Thus, by June 1863, that's the month of the basic health reform vision, Seventh-day Adventists were already in possession of the main outlines of the health reform message. What they now needed to become a church of health reformers was not additional information, but a sign from God indicating His pleasure. Now, Ellen White states, and this is found in the Review and Herald of October 8, 1867, and Elder Bradley said he wished everyone could read it, and those who have the reprints, the facsimile reprints of the G.E.G. White articles, can turn to it and read it.
Right.
It's very well worthwhile. The October 8, 1867. Here's her declaration in answer to a question. Where did you get your light on health reform? She says it was at the house of Brother A. Hilliard at Otsego, Michigan, June 6, 1863, that the great subject of health reform was opened before me in vision. As I introduced the subject of health to friends where I labored in Michigan, New England, and New York, and spoke against drugs and flesh meats and in favor of water, pure air, and a proper diet, the reply was often made, "You speak very nearly the opinions taught in the Laws of Life and other publications by Drs. Troll, Jackson, and others. Have you read that paper and those works?" My reply was that I had not, neither should I read them till I had fully written out my views, lest it should be said that I received my light upon the subject of health from physicians and not from the Lord. So we have, this is really the crux of the matter. We have the contrasting statements. Ellen White declares that she gained it from the Lord. The author of the book declares that she had gained this information from her associates and her contemporaries, and he cites a few instances of where some principles, some tenets of reform in health were being adopted by some of our early pioneers. Now, an examination of the records is important in this connection. The certain individuals are cited. For instance, Andrews is cited, and it's true the Andrews family offered some example of progress towards health reform. Mrs. Andrews left a diary for the years 1859 through 1864. The diary opens with the announcement that the family had just butchered a pig. A little later, we find in the fall of 1862, the little Andrews' daughter Mary contracted whooping cough. The mother on several occasions wrapped the baby in wet sheets in an apparent attempt to reduce her fever. The local doctor was called in 2 or 3 times and administered a hodgepodge of poisons and herbal remedies. Among these were ipecac, nitre, and quinine, and later she was given the latter was given as a tonic. Now, in her desperation, Mrs. Andrews was willing to try anything. She secured a recipe for syrup from her sister in Battle Creek. After some searching, she found the ingredients, and as the story is told in the diary, we gave her a dose immediately. I think Mary was never been sicker than this afternoon. Medicine has no effect to vomit her, as I supposed it would. And we could go on. But actually, when it comes right down to the documented facts, it was in the spring of 1863. Andrews pinpoints his family's adoption of health reform 9 months after Mrs. White's vision. It was in March 1864 that myself and wife decided to adopt the principles of health reform. We might cite other illustrations. Loughborough is mentioned. Loughborough began eating graham bread and read the Water Cure Journal, he says, in 1848. However, the book fails to go on to mention that the same source states that the ideas adopted by Loughborough from these sources were vague, and when in 1850 he developed slight hemorrhages of the lungs, he was advised to smoke a pipe for relief. He couldn't tolerate a pipe, so he adopted cigars instead. Loughborough didn't consider himself to be a strict health reformer until after the vision was given to Mrs. White in 1863 and the publication of her first writings on health. Writing in December of 64, he said, "For a short time, I've been striving to live strictly in accordance with the laws of life. I've been greatly benefited." The Kellogg family is mentioned, and we find that John Kellogg reports that his favorite food was oxtails richly browned, and the Kellogg's kept a keg of ale in the cellar for a weak stomach. So, Prophetess of Health doesn't present a full picture. He's very selective. The author is very selective in choosing some indications that some Adventists were using some stray phases of tenets of health, but there was no message. Ellen White declares of her own knowledge at the time the vision was given to her, I was astonished at the things shown me in the vision. Many things came directly across my own ideas. And so it's very clear when one has all the documented evidence before him, and this can be available to all of our ministers. In fact, many of our ministers have it in hand already in the documented discussion and review of Prophetess of Health, and it's being dealt with more fully in a critique of the book, which will soon be available. When this documentary evidence is presented, we see that the author of Prophetess of Health has selected what he could use to demonstrate his point, which he's trying to make, that the whites were in possession of the basic, or the Adventists were in possession of the basic principles of health reform before the vision was ever given to Ellen White, and thus it makes the claim of Ellen White that she gained this knowledge from vision invalid.
But, Elder Brethren, are there not some questions raised in the book that are not satisfactorily answered, even today, by modern medical science?
Yes, there are some questions that aren't answered to everyone's satisfaction, we'll put it that way. Orly, I took a class some years ago under Elder M.L. Andreasen. And I remember he told us one day that he had a compartment in his mind filled with unsolved problems. And he wasn't referring to the spirit of prophecy in particular. He was talking about the Bible, some things that he couldn't understand. And he said quite frequently one of those came out and a solution was found, and new problems were put in. Now, when we read some things in the spirit of prophecy writings, there are some things that have not yet been confirmed by medical science, some of her health statements. I might mention 3. All of these are referred to in the Numbers book. One is her reference to masturbation, where she does link this with certain diseases, imbecility and other diseases. Another is her statement about wigs appearing in the October 1871 Health Reformer, where she said the wearing of these very heavy wigs heated the base of the brain and had a negative effect on the individual's, on the wearer's morals. And a third statement is where she says that the eating of pork, especially in warm climates, can cause leprosy. Now, we don't have scientific confirmation on these statements. It's not saying that there isn't some validity to them, But I have put these in my compartment of unsolved problems. And when we get more information, why, it may be surprising
Could
as
be.
to the confirmation that will come.
Now, if we were to go back 30 years, we would be able to put more in that compartment, Bob. For instance, Ellen White declared that linked cancer with a germ, and medical science positively declared that there was no connection, there was no infectious factor in connection with cancer. But that isn't what medical science is saying today. For beginning with 1954, materials began to appear which would link as one of the causative factors of cancer a virus, which is a miniature germ. Or we take her statement concerning prenatal influence, which was denied by psychologists and others up to 1954, when scientific information became available, which made it very clear that there was prenatal influence. I remember the banner headlines in an article in one of the journals, "There is prenatal influence," and when the article read very much like Ellen White. Or in 1958, on the matter of linking birth defects with drugs. Why, no physician would think of doing that. And we'd have to put this in one of those compartments, Bob. But then we had not only the discovery of the fact that there were factors in drugs and alcohol, which was the cause of birth defects, and then the thalidomide tragedy just underlined the whole thing and forever wiped out any question on that point. So if we're to wait a little while, we may find answers to some of these unanswered questions.
Well, I think, really, Orly, if I can continue this a moment on the subject of masturbation, I think we have some evidence. This is certainly not anything that is cut and dried. But I want to refer to a study by a psychiatrist by the name of E.H. Hare. It's a recent study called Masturbatory Insanity, the History of an Idea. And he refers to a study of 500 patients admitted consecutively to the Iowa State Psychopathic Hospital. He says that the authors of the study, Henderson and Gillespie, found that in 22 cases, masturbation was, quotes, apparently the most important cause of disorder, unquotes, quoting the two men who made the study. And then Dr. Hare goes on and says this: the authors concluded that it was the mental conflict engendered by masturbation rather than the habit itself which led to the illness. And they believed that this conclusion to be supported by the efficacy of psychotherapy directed toward readjusting the patient's ideas about masturbation. In other words, persuade him that he shouldn't have a sense of guilt, and then he'd improve physically. Yet, the fact that 15 of the 22 patients suffered from depression must raise doubts about the validity even of this temperate conclusion, for the depressed patient is not only prone to blame himself for neglect of what he believes to be the rules of health, but also tends to recover from his illness, whether treated by psychotherapy or not. And then, after acknowledging that there is no way of disproving the masturbatory hypothesis, that is, that it can cause insanity, Hare offers his final conclusion. I'm quoting Hare now, the psychiatrist. All we can say from the evidence is that the association between masturbation and mental disorder is weak and inconstant, and that therefore if masturbation is a causal factor, it is probably not a very important one, unquotes. Now, here is a medical authority, a psychiatrist, who is willing to allow that there may be at least a slight causal relationship, yes, between masturbation and certain functional disorders, including insanity. Now, I want to emphasize that psychiatrists and other medical people hold their present view that masturbation is harmless strictly as an opinion. It cannot be proven. No scientific evidence has ever been produced which proves that masturbation does not cause functional illness. So we wait for more information on that.
Bob, would you have a closing statement there? And then we'll have Elder White speak with his final words.
Orly, I see the hand on the clock moving around fast. It's almost time for us to close. But there's much I would like to say. But the impression is given to the reader of the book that Ellen White is just a copyist, you see, getting all her information from others. And nothing is said about where she differed from many health writers of her day. And I would like to just quickly mention some of these. Maybe I won't take time to read them.
Well, read a couple there. You
All
have some
right.
good statements.
Let's take the subject of physical exercise. Dr. James Jackson, who is one that Mrs. White knew and is supposed to have influenced her a great deal, wrote this about physical exercise. With us, it is a favorite idea that to save the strength of our patients is quite as philosophical as to spend it, and therefore we arrange all our relations to them from this view. In other words, he told his patients that they should not exert themselves, but just rest. Here's what Mrs. White said. The fact that Elder White's illness was the result of overwork, together with the instructions of the Dansville physicians concerning the importance of entire rest, led him in his feeble state to shrink from all exertion. Here was one of the most serious obstacles to his recovery. See, she did not agree with the Dansville physician. Naturally a man of great activity, both of body and mind, he had been constantly occupied previous to his illness in planning and carrying forward important enterprises. And now to sink down in aimless inactivity was to foster disease and to become the prey of despondency. Now, I have another number of other illustrations like this. On the matter of salt, Dr. Jackson said, as for common salt, I rank it, notwithstanding all the learned twaddle that is offered to the contrary, among those substances which are justly labeled as poisonous. Ellen White never said anything like that. She said, I use some salt, I always have. And the sugar, Dr. Jackson said, sugar may without positive injury be used quite freely. Ellen White said the opposite. The free use of sugar would be harmful to you. Vinegar and pickles, he favored them. She did not. And just a little example of how often an infant should be nursed by its mother. Dr. Cole said 3 times a day is maximum. Ellen White differed. She said, those are not my words and they're not my sentiments. And let's take the matter of milk. In our own health journal, here's Dr. Trawl writing. I'll quote him. Physicians, chemists, and physiologists are continually writing up the praises of salt, sugar, and milk as useful and necessary articles of food for adult human beings. Regardless of the scientific facts that salt is a mineral poison, sugar is not food at all, and milk is only adapted to the stage of infancy preceding the development of the teeth. Well, now, Mrs. White never writes like this about milk. She says the time may come when we have to give it up, but wait till the circumstances demand it. The Lord prepares the way for it. That's in Volume 9 of the Testimonies.
Most remarkable that she knew just exactly what to choose out of the information that was then available.
She didn't drop into all of these pitfalls that these other men were writing about. We can see now she was right and they were wrong.
All right, Elder White.
Well, we would recommend to every minister, as I have in teaching at the seminary in my class on prophetic guidance, the very careful study of the D.E. Robinson book, Story of Our Health Message, prepared in the White Estate Office. Ellen White had a desire to prepare a book on the story of our health reform message. She never got to it, but the book was prepared in our office, working from the carefully documented sources, and this book is available for 75 cents. It contains 450 pages, and there the true story is presented. And we think it'll be more valuable than the 240-page book, Prophetess of Health, which sells for $10. We have sent to you through your conference, that is the North American Division has sent to you through your conference, a discussion and review of Prophetess of Health. This is a rather brief document. We would call your attention particularly to Dr. Kellogg's statements on page 17 of this, and also in just the inside of the cover, page 2. They're well worth reading, but we haven't time to read them now. And then, of course, there is the larger critique of 250 pages, which is in preparation now and will soon be available, going more into detail, and available from our office or the branch office at Berrien Springs or any of the research centers.
That's the Ellen G. White Estate General Conference, Washington, D.C., 20012.
That's right.
Any charge?
For the discussion and review, there's no charge. For the critique, there is a $4 charge to cover the cost of duplicating and mailing.
Thank you very much, brethren.